Hello students, today we are going to discuss sexual reproduction in flowering plants part 3. For the part 2 and part 1, please check the description box in which the link was given and delivered by me. So in continuation with the first and second, now I am going to discuss the part 3 of the sexual reproduction in flowering plants, in which today we are going to discuss especially the pollination. Pollination. The transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma is called pollination. Pollination is of two types: self-pollination within the same flower and cross-pollination to genetically different flowers. The flow chart is showing the pollination is of two types: self and cross-pollination. The pollination. Now here in this diagram you are going to see the pollen grain lands from anther to the stigma of the same flower. It means both are in the same flower, and that is act is known as the self-pollination. But in cross-pollination you will find two different flowers in which the pollen lands from anther to the stigma. Since the two different flowers are involved, that act is known as the cross-pollination. The definition of the self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same or genetically similar flower is known as the self-pollination. It is of two types: autogamy and genetogamy. The self-pollination is occurred by autogamy and genetogamy. The flow chart itself is showing. Now we are going to discuss the autogamy. It is a type of self-pollination of intersexual or perfect flower. It means both the sex organs, male and female, present in the same flower by its own pollen. It occurs by three methods: the homogamy, clastogamy, and bud pollination. Now in the diagram you will find the pollen grain lands on the stigma. Whenever the pollen grain lands on the stigma, pollen tube generally develops for the pollen grain to land in the ovary to fuse with the egg. Now diagram is showing that the pollen grain lands in the ovary, where the nucleus of the pollen grain passes down the pollen tube and fertilizes the ovule or egg present inside the ovary. Now we are going to discuss the homogamy. Here the anther and stigma of chasmogamous or open flower. It means the flower is open, and with this opening the male and female are going to come close together with the help of growth, maybe binding or by folding, and when they are going to come it with each other, they act, they fuses, and of course the self-pollination occur. Example is mirabilis. The next is clastogamy. Here the flowers are intersexual and remain closed, and whenever the flower remain closed, it ensures the pollination. And these plants possess both the chasmogamous as well as the clastogamous. It means the open or the closed flowers. Example is balsam and oxalis. And the bud pollination, here you will find this anther and stigma of a perfect flower ripen before the opening of the bud for self-pollination. It means before the bud is going to open, anther and stigma is going to mature to perform the act of self-pollination. Example is pea, wheat, and rice. Genetogamy. It is a type of self-pollination where pollen grain of one flower transfer to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. It means the plant remain the same, but flowers are going to be different. Now in this diagram you will find first the self-pollination, two flowers of the same plant, and that act is known as the autogamy. Next is self-pollination by genetogamy. Two flowers where the transfer of the pollen grain to the anther to stigma, and that act is known as a genetogamy. But in the next, cross pollination, two different flowers in which the pollination occur, that act is known as cross pollination. Now we are going to discuss cross pollination is also known as xenogamy. Here, the pollen grain transfer from anther to stigma of genetically different flowers. It is also called as allogamy. So cross-pollination, xenogamy, allogamy all are same, and cross-pollination occurs by or performed by abiotic or biotic agents. Abiotic means non-living and biotic means living. The flow chart shows the pollination. Self is known as autogamy, cross pollination is known as a xenogamy or allogamy. The abiotic agents which involved are wind or water. Biotic is explained over there, which I'll discuss later on. Now, the type of pollination. The first one, whenever the pollination occurs by wind, that act is known as the anemophily, and with water, hydrophily. Now the biotic which are living, whenever the pollination occurs by insects is called entomophily, and by birds, ornithophily, with the help of bats, chiropterophily, with the help of ants, mycophily. Now we are going to discuss the characteristics of the cross pollination occurred by the abiotic agents. First, the anemophily. When pollination occurs by wind, that act is known as the anemophily. Example is dandelion, date palm and maize. The characteristic of anemophily flowers are generally flowers are small, colorless, odorless and nectarless. Now when the flowers are small, colorless and odorless, they remain very light so that can move from one place to another easily with the help of wind. Very large number of pollen grains are produced. Why? Because since they had to travel from one place to another, so at last the ensurety of pollination is going to be occurred when large number of pollen grains are produced. And pollen grains here are light, small and dusty. These are also dry and unwettable. Now stigma of these flowers generally here to catch the pollen grains. They are also feathery also, or the branch to catch the wind-borne pollen grains. The diagram is showing this anemophily. Here you will find the hair or light feather where the pollen grains are going to move and stuck to the feather of the stigma to ensure the act of the pollination. Hydrophily, pollination by water. Example of the hydrophily is Vallisneria, Hydrilla and several marine sea grasses, for example Zostera. The characteristic of hydrophily flowers are small and inconspicuous. The nectar and odor are absent. Pollen grains are very light and unwettable. Why they are going to be unwettable? Because they had got a covering of mucilage. Now you'll find this male and female inside the water where the pollen is going to be transferred from the anther to the stigma to ensure the act of pollination, and this also explains the hydrophily. The cross pollination or xenogamy is also occurred by biotic agents. First is entomophily. It's a pollination by animals. Example you will find jasmine and arum. Characteristic of entomophily flowers are they are going to be very color to attract the animals, also produces the odor which also attract the animals, and odor is always pleasant. Nectar is also secreted. The diagram is showing the entomophily, ornithophily, chiropterophily and mycophily. Here you will find The first is insect, then bird, then bat, and then you will find the ant. Thank you very much.